I discovered my dad isn't my biological father, and it destroyed our family. My name's John, and I'm 20 years old. Growing up, I always felt like my life was pretty normal. Average, even. My parents, Sarah and David, were kind, hardworking people who raised me with love, values, and stability. There was never any reason to question anything about my life. I mean, why would I? My family was all I knew, and I thought I knew them. But everything changed the day I found that folder in the attic. It was the day my entire world crumbled. I wasn't even supposed to be in the attic that day. I was just helping my mom organize some old things. She had asked me to grab a few boxes she wanted to sort through. I'd always hated the attic. It was dusty, cramped, and full of old memories that felt heavy to me. Boxes of old photos, toys from when I was a kid, random stuff that we never used but never threw away. I was moving one of the bigger boxes when a thin folder slipped out from between two other stacks. It was old, yellowed with time, and had no label, just plain and unremarkable. I should have just put it back, I know that now. But something made me curious. Maybe it was because it seemed so out of place, almost like it didn't belong. I opened it without a second thought, expecting to find old documents or photos. What I saw instead hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a DNA test with my name at the top. And right next to it, under Father, was the name of a man I had never heard of before. Not my dad. Not David. This stranger's name was on the paper and my stomach dropped. I read it over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to force my brain to connect dots that didn't want to connect. But no matter how many times I read it, the conclusion was the same. David, the man who had raised me, wasn't my biological father. I don't know how long I stood there just staring at that piece of paper. My mind raced with questions, but mostly I felt numb. How could this be? Why hadn't anyone told me? Did David know? Did anyone know? A million thoughts spiraled through my head, but none of them felt real. It was like being trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I heard my mom calling from downstairs, her voice casual, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I stuffed the folder back where it had fallen, trying to hide the evidence, but it was too late. The damage was done. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had to get out of there. I needed space. I needed air. I rushed downstairs, my mom asking if I found the boxes she needed. I barely responded, muttering something about feeling sick, and left the house. I walked out into the yard, but even the open air felt suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. My legs felt weak, like I was going to collapse any second. I sat down on the porch steps, my mind spinning. Everything felt surreal. The family I thought I knew, the man I called Dad for 20 years, suddenly felt like a stranger. Who was he? Who was I? It felt like my entire identity had been ripped away in an instant, like the foundation of my life had crumbled beneath me. I thought about David, about how he taught me to ride a bike, how he sat through my baseball games even when I wasn't that good, how he always told me how proud he was of me. Was all of that a lie? Did he know? How could he love me like that if I wasn't really his? The thoughts kept swirling, and with each one my heart ached more. I stayed outside for hours, replaying every memory I had of David, of our family. I wanted to hate him, to feel angry, but all I felt was confusion and sadness. If he wasn't my father, who was? Why had my mother kept this from me? I thought about confronting her, about demanding answers, but I was too afraid of what she might say. As the sun began to set, I realized I couldn't avoid this forever. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. But deep down, part of me already knew that things would never be the same again. That piece of paper had shattered everything, and there was no going back. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. My thoughts were too loud, too painful. I stared at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next, how to deal with this. Should I tell David I knew? Should I talk to my mom? Would they even tell me the truth if I asked? Every possibility scared me, but what scared me most was the uncertainty. The not knowing was killing me. In that moment, I realized my life had changed forever. That simple discovery in the attic had torn a hole in the fabric of my family, and no matter what happened next, nothing could ever fix it. The secret was out, and the damage was done. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to confront my mom. I spent hours pacing around my room, rehearsing how I would say it, what I would ask, but no matter how much I practiced in my head, I knew there was no easy way to have this conversation. This was going to change everything, and I was terrified of what I might hear. Finally, around midday, I walked downstairs. My mom was in the kitchen, humming to herself while chopping vegetables for lunch. She looked so calm, so normal, like she wasn't hiding this massive secret. I stood there for a moment, just watching her, trying to understand how she could carry on with life as if nothing was wrong. I cleared my throat, and she glanced up with a smile. "Hey, sweetie, you feeling better?" My throat was dry. I couldn't answer right away. Instead, I just blurted it out. "Mom, I need to ask you something." Her smile faded a little. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "I found something in the attic yesterday, a DNA test, with my name on it." I saw the color drain from her face instantly. The knife she was holding clattered to the counter, and her hand went to her mouth, covering a gasp. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at me, wide-eyed, as if she was seeing a ghost. "How long were you going to keep this from me?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" She stumbled over her words. "John, I didn't. I never wanted you to find out like this." "Well, I did," I nearly shouted, the frustration boiling over. "I found it, and now I don't know who I am anymore. You've been lying to me my whole life." Her face crumpled, and I could see the pain in her eyes, but at that moment, I didn't care. I needed answers. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. She took a shaky breath and sat down at the kitchen table, motioning for me to sit across from her. Reluctantly, I did. "John," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's true. David, your father, he's not your biological father." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Even though I had already suspected it, hearing her say it made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Who is he then?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Who's my real father?" She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "It's complicated." "Just tell me, Mom," I snapped, feeling the frustration bubbling up again. "I deserve to know." She looked up at me, tears filling her eyes. "Your biological father is your uncle." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. My uncle? My uncle? The room spun around me, and for a moment I thought I might be sick. "Uncle Mike?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "It was a mistake, John. It happened right after David and I got married. I was young, confused, and Mike was there. One thing led to another, and I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to happen." I sat there, stunned, trying to process what she was saying. My mind raced. Images of family holidays, birthdays, barbecues, all the times we'd spent with Uncle Mike flashed before my eyes. He was always there, always part of the family. But now, knowing he was my biological father, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "How could you do this?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "How could you lie to me all these years? Does Dad know? Does he know?" She wiped at her tears, her face crumpling with guilt. "David knows. He's known since you were a baby. But he loved you, John. He always has. He raised you as his own, because in his heart, you are his son." That should have brought me some comfort, but it didn't. Not in that moment. All I could feel was betrayal. Betrayal from my mom, from David, from Mike. How could they all have kept this from me? How could they have built this web of lies and pretended everything was normal? I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "John, please," my mom begged, standing up and reaching for me. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to break our family. David and we thought it was best if you never knew." "Well, you were wrong," I shouted, stepping back from her. "You were all wrong. You should have told me the truth." The weight of it all was crushing me, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I turned and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the front door behind me as I ran outside. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. Away from the lies, away from the people who had kept this secret for so long. I found myself walking aimlessly down the street, my mind still spinning. My uncle? My uncle was my father? How was I supposed to process that? How was I supposed to ever look at him, at my mom, at David the same way again? I thought about David, the man who had raised me, who had been there for me every step of the way. He had known all along, and yet he had never treated me any differently. He had loved me like his own, despite knowing the truth. But that didn't make the betrayal any less painful. In some ways, it made it worse. He had known, and still he had kept it from me. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. My whole life had been a lie. Every memory, every moment felt tainted now. I didn't know who I was anymore. Was I David's son? Was I Mike's? What did that make me? I wandered for hours, lost in my thoughts, before eventually finding myself sitting on a park bench, staring blankly at the trees swaying in the breeze. The world around me felt so normal, but inside I was falling apart. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know how to face my family, how to deal with this new reality. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. The truth was out, and it had shattered my life in ways I never could have imagined. I spent the next few days avoiding my family. Every time I thought about going home, the walls seemed to close in on me. I couldn't bring myself to face them. Not after everything I'd learned. I stayed with a friend, claiming I needed some space, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. Eventually, though, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to talk to David. He had raised me, loved me, been the father I always thought was mine. But now, everything between us felt like a lie. I needed to hear his side of the story. I needed to know how he could have kept this from me for so long. When I finally walked through the front door of our house, David was sitting at the dining table, reading a newspaper. My mom was nowhere in sight. He looked up as soon as I entered, his face tense. He knew why I was there. "John," he said, his voice cautious. "We need to talk, don't we?" I nodded, sitting down across from him. My hands were shaking, but I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. I was angry, but there was also a part of me that still saw him as my dad, the man who had taught me everything, the man who had been there for every birthday, every game, every hard moment of my life. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice low, trembling. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" David sighed, putting the newspaper aside and rubbing his hands over his face. He looked exhausted, like the weight of the years had suddenly caught up to him all at once. "I wanted to," he said quietly. "Believe me, I did. But it was complicated. Your mom and I decided after you were born that it was best for you to grow up not knowing. We didn't want to confuse you, or—" "Confuse me?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "Do you have any idea how much worse it is to find out like this? Do you know what it feels like to realize your whole life has been a lie?" His face twisted with guilt, and for a second, I felt a twinge of sympathy. But it wasn't enough to dull the pain in my chest. "I'm sorry, John," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been your father in every way that matters. I loved you from the moment I held you, and nothing about that has changed." "But you're not my father," I said coldly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "You're not my real father." David flinched, like I'd struck him. His eyes filled with pain, and for a moment I regretted what I said. But I couldn't take it back. The damage was already done. "I may not be your biological father," he said, his voice trembling. "But I raised you. I've been here for you every day of your life. Does that mean nothing to you?" "I don't know what it means anymore," I whispered, looking down at the table. My mind was a mess, tangled in emotions I couldn't untangle. How was I supposed to process this? We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. The air between us felt thick with tension and unspoken words. Finally, I looked up at him, my voice quieter now. "Did you ever hate me for it? Did you ever resent me?" David's eyes softened and he shook his head. "Never. Not for a second. You're my son, John. You always have been. That's never changed." His words were sincere and I could feel the love in them, but it didn't ease the ache in my chest. I wanted to believe him, but how could I? How could I trust anything when the very foundation of my identity had been built on lies? At that moment, the front door opened and my mom walked in. She froze when she saw us, realizing what was happening. Her eyes flickered with fear, like she knew things were about to fall apart. "We're talking," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "About everything." She sat down at the table, joining us in the heavy silence that had taken over the room. None of us knew how to start, how to bridge the gap that had suddenly appeared between us. My family felt like strangers now, and I didn't know how to come back from that. But then my sister, Emily, came in. She looked confused, sensing the tension in the room immediately. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between us. I hadn't told Emily anything yet. She was 2 years younger than me, always the one to lighten the mood whenever things got tense. But there was no lightness here. No way to make this easier. Before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out of my mouth. "David's not my real father. Uncle Mike is." Emily's face went white. She stood there, frozen in place, as if I had just shattered the world she knew. "What?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. Mom burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. David looked down at the table, silent, while Emily turned to me, her eyes wide with shock. "That's not true," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying. You're just trying to—" "I'm not," I said, my voice cracking. "It's the truth." The room erupted into chaos. Emily started yelling, demanding answers from our mom, from David, from me. She couldn't believe it. She didn't want to. But the truth was out now, and there was no hiding from it. Our family was crumbling right in front of us. Years of secrets, years of pretending everything was fine. It was all falling apart. The people I loved, the people I thought I knew, were slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. As I watched my mom sobbing, my dad silently breaking down, and my sister screaming in disbelief, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. This secret had destroyed us. It had fractured our family in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend, and I was the one left standing in the wreckage, wondering if we could ever rebuild from this. The next few days passed in a blur. The house felt emptier than ever, even though everything was still physically in place. My dad hadn't taken much with him, just a bag of clothes, the essentials, but his absence was louder than any fight we'd ever had. I didn't know where he went. Mom wouldn't tell me, and I wasn't sure if she even knew. All I knew was that the man who had been my father my entire life had left, and it was because of me. I couldn't stop replaying the last conversation we had before he left. The hurt in his eyes when I called him not my real father. The way his shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth. And now, I was terrified. What if things never went back to the way they were? What if he could never look at me the same way again? It felt like I'd lost something irreplaceable. Something more than just the comfortable illusion of our family. I had shattered the only image of my life that made sense, and in its place was a void. A deep uncertainty about who I even was. Every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted into knots. I kept asking myself the same question. Who was I if David wasn't my real father? I sat alone in my room, looking at old photos. There was one of me as a toddler, sitting on David's lap while he read me a book. He had that soft smile, the kind that told you everything was going to be okay. I had believed in that smile my whole life. Now, I wasn't sure if I'd ever see it again. How was I supposed to feel? I couldn't ignore the truth, but at the same time, I didn't want this truth. I didn't want to trade David for someone like Mike. Sure, Mike was my biological father, but what did that even mean? The man barely existed in my life beyond occasional family gatherings. He wasn't the one who had raised me, who had been there through every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph. That had been David. In my heart, I knew that, and yet, the blood running through my veins told a different story. The thought of Mike being my father felt wrong. It felt like an insult to everything David had done for me. I didn't want that kind of relationship with Mike. He wasn't my father, not in any way that mattered, but the fear still gnawed at me. What if David couldn't see me as his son anymore? What if I couldn't see him the same way? Could we ever go back to the way things were before this truth ripped us apart? I hadn't seen Mike since the day everything came out. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to scream at him for tearing our family apart. But another part of me was too afraid of what I'd find if I did. What could he possibly say that would make this better? I already knew the truth, and that truth had ruined everything. I tried to keep my distance from everyone, Mom, Emily, even my friends. I didn't know how to talk to anyone about this. How could I explain to them that I didn't even know who I was anymore? I barely recognized myself when I looked in the mirror. I wasn't the person I thought I was. And the person I had been was disappearing with every passing day, with every moment that my dad stayed away from home. Then one evening, my mom came into my room. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her face still swollen from crying. I could tell she wanted to talk, but I didn't know if I had it in me. I was still angry at her, at Mike, at David, at the whole damn situation. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly, her voice tentative. I shrugged. "I don't know, Mom. It's just, everything's messed up." She nodded, looking down at her hands. I know I hurt you, and I hurt David. I never wanted this to come out like this. "I don't know how to fix this," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I feel like I've lost him. What if he never comes back? What if I never see him the same way again?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Your dad loves you, John, no matter what. That's never gonna change." "But how can he?" I asked, my frustration bubbling over. "How can he still see me as his son after this? How can I?" "Because you are his son," she said firmly. "He raised you. He's been there for every part of your life. Blood doesn't change that." I looked away, blinking back my own tears. "I don't want Mike to be my dad. I don't want anything to do with him." My mom reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. "I understand, but that doesn't change what happened. Mike is part of your past now, but he doesn't have to be part of your future unless you want him to be. That's your choice, John." Her words echoed in my head long after she left the room. I didn't know if I could ever make peace with the fact that Mike was my biological father. I didn't want to. But I also couldn't shake the fear that my relationship with David would never be the same. The man who had been my dad, the man who had loved me unconditionally, had walked out of the door because of the truth I had uncovered, and now I had no idea if he'd ever come back. I wanted to believe that love was stronger than blood, that what we had built together over the years would be enough to bring him back. But every time I thought about it, doubt crept in. What if it wasn't enough? What if this truth had destroyed everything beyond repair? I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. Weeks passed, but my father didn't come back. Every day I waited for a phone call, a knock on the door, a sign that he was ready to come home and mend what had been broken. But nothing came. The silence was deafening, and with each passing day, the emptiness grew heavier. Mom tried her best to keep things together, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She was holding on by a thread, and I knew that I was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. I felt guilty for that, for being the cause of this family's disintegration, but I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't undo the truth. One afternoon, I was in the living room when Mom came in with a letter in her hand. She looked more fragile than ever, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She handed me the envelope without saying a word. I took it, my heart pounding as I opened it. It was from Dad. In it, he wrote, "John, I don't know how to say this, but I'm leaving. I can't stay here, knowing that Mike is your biological father. It's a truth that's too painful for me to bear. I thought I could be strong, that love would be enough to overcome anything, but I was wrong. I need time away from all of this. I need to find myself again. I want you to know that I love you more than words can express. This isn't about you. It's about me, not being able to reconcile the reality of the situation. I hope you understand. Goodbye, David." The letter felt like a punch in the gut. David wasn't coming back. The reality that he had left because he couldn't accept Mike as my biological father was crushing. I read the letter over and over, trying to make sense of it, but it only deepened the pain. Mom sat down beside me, her hand resting gently on mine. "He's not coming back, is he?" she asked quietly. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No. He can't accept it. He can't accept Mike being my real father." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, John. I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can." The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever faced. The house was filled with an unbearable silence, a void where laughter and warmth used to be. My relationship with Mom was strained, too. We were both grieving, but we were grieving differently. I was angry, hurt, and lost. She was trying to be strong for me, but her strength was waning. I tried to reach out to Mike, hoping to find some semblance of closure or understanding, but every time I saw him, the anger and betrayal surged up again. He wasn't just a stranger to me. He was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. I couldn't bring myself to build any kind of relationship with him. I didn't want to. Months went by, and the holidays came. They felt hollow, empty without David. I tried to enjoy them for Mom's sake, but it was impossible to ignore the gaping hole in our lives. The absence of my father was a constant reminder of the family we had lost. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, I thought about the future. What would my life look like without David? Could I ever come to terms with what had happened? Would I ever be able to rebuild, or was this the end of our family as I knew it? The thought of letting go was almost as painful as the reality of losing David. He had been my father in every sense that mattered, and now that was gone. But maybe letting go was the only way forward. I had to accept that some things were beyond repair, and this was one of them. I made the decision to start focusing on my own healing, on finding my own path without the shadow of the past hanging over me. It wasn't about forgetting David or erasing what he meant to me. It was about coming to terms with the reality of our broken family and trying to move forward with whatever remained. Mom and I had to face the new reality of our lives without him. It wasn't easy. There were days filled with tears, anger, and regret, but there were also moments of understanding and acceptance. We had to build a new normal, one where we were just two people trying to navigate a world that had changed dramatically. One evening, as I sat with Mom, I realized something important. Despite everything, despite the pain and the heartbreak, we still had each other. The family we had before was gone, but we could still find a way to move forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it would never be the same, but we had to try. For ourselves, if not for the family we once were. In the end, I accepted that the relationship I had with David was forever altered. It was a painful truth, but it was a part of my story now. I had to find a way to live with that, to rebuild my sense of self, and to embrace whatever future lay ahead. As I looked out the window, watching the sunset, I felt a mixture of sadness and hope. The future was uncertain, but I knew that I had the strength to face it. It wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to rebuild my life and find peace in the midst of the brokenness. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. See you next time.